when I was going around suggesting that there should be formal training available to OBGYNs, the answers that I got was women just shouldn't be getting those surgeries, victim blaming. And I
Mm.
said, but these are approved by ACOG, even in women under 18. And yet the answer to, hey, maybe doctors should be trained is women just shouldn't be getting those surgeries.
Jessica, welcome to the Holistic OBGYN podcast. I'm really happy to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Cape Cod, you're in Cape Cod right now. What brought you to Cape Cod?
My family goes here every summer.
This is it. It's sort of like reminds me of the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, where they head out to their like summer home or something like that and camp and all that.
Yeah.
That's right. That's awesome. I just met your dad, who's a plastic surgeon, and we were kind of teetering into the conversation around what would be considered their lane, staying in their lane. And you would expect the surgeon to know every last aspect of the part of the body that they're operating on. And your story is special because you had a surgeon, probably a very well-trained surgeon, who was doing an operation on a very delicate part of your body. And you're going to tell your story, but they either didn't know what they were doing, or they were doing something that was a little cavalier for them. And the crux of this conversation is going to be, when a person comes to a doctor, what should the doctor feel compelled to share with them about their experience in doing something? And if they don't know, they don't know. That's okay. But don't start operating based on some presumption of what you want what the patient says they want. So Jessica, welcome. We're going to be talking all sorts of vulva and clitoris. And so if anybody out there doesn't like those words, this is not the episode for you. We're going to be talking about anatomy. Jessica, tell us what happened. I know that you've told your story a number of times, but my audience is going to be very fresh to this. Tell us what happened.
So I had a labiaplasty when I was barely 18 years old. And I actually went to an OBGYN who was recommended as the best OBGYN at the hospital where my dad also works. And he completely removed my labia minora and he performed a clitoral head reduction without my consent.
Hmm.
And I lost clitoral sensation. So that's what happened. And then after my surgery, other OBGYNs told me that what happened to me couldn't have happened. Um, they told me that my problem
Gaslight.
was psychological, that I just needed to relax. One OBGYN told me I just needed to fall in love. Alarmingly, one OBGYN told me I looked normal. So I got the idea that OBGYNs really didn't know what was going on. And I taught myself the anatomy and I figured out that my nerves had been injured. And so I advocate for better anatomy to be taught to OBGYNs and also plastic surgeons.
Amazing. That's a perfect summary. And you were very, very young. You had this impression that something needed to be modified. We'll get into maybe why you had those impressions. But the bottom line being, you went to a doctor. The doctor, in defense, in his or her defense, they said, well, this is what you asked for. This is what you wanted. So there's a whole bunch of worms in this can that I'm about to spill out. Because first off, I did see labioplasties when I was in residency. There was one doctor who did it, and she did it exactly the same way you had described it on Mark Grove's podcast. She would put the labia on traction, and this was labia majora, not the labia minora necessarily. Put the labia on traction, draw a line as to where you would expect that sort of appropriate border to be based on who knows what.
Wait,
And
why
then
was she pulling on the labia majora?
I apologize. So the labia minora, for anybody out there listening, the labia majora are kind of like the sort of fatty mounds over the bulb, the cavernosus muscles that everybody sees in childbirth, the labia minora in the inside. And you're right, it was the labia minora. So she put it on tension, drew a line with her, like a marker, put it
Mhm.
on tension, and then performed the procedure, and then got all the bleeding under control or whatever, and good to go. She used either a scalpel or she used like a laser. It was like a laser, CO2 laser, in order to just slice through the tissue. And as a resident, you don't really get to see people for follow-up, but there was only one doctor in the whole group. I went to Kaiser for residency, and everybody, it presumably, was happy with it. but we didn't even get to see what the counseling was like as to, hey, we need to
Presumably.
presumably, yes, because we as residents don't get to see them for follow-up because they were our attending's patient. We just happened to be there to assist with the surgery. So I had seen it, but when you describe the whole pulling of it and you sort of distort the anatomy, and then when it goes back after you've injected lidocaine or whatever else, it goes back, you don't actually know what the final product is going to look like until they come back to you and perhaps they're complaining of something. But I never saw them for follow-up for in that way. And we only saw maybe 10 of those. But was this a GYN who was specifically trained in plastic surgery or maybe even knew the anatomy of the clitoris? I would, based on the fact that I didn't really fully understand the anatomy of the clitoris, I can't say that many other people do as well.
Yeah, I doubt that she knew.
Yeah.
That technique that she used is how they end up removing too much labia minora. That's how accidental complete amputations happen.
Yeah.
That's also how they describe doing it on Up to Date and also in Baggish Atlas of Pelvic Anatomy and Gynecologic Surgery. I
Yeah.
tried to get that changed because actually in Baggish, they in the illustration, it actually looks like they're removing basically all the labia minora, and then they show a real patient, and it looks like her labia minora are being completely removed. And it's strange because she has severe hypertrophy. And so when you see a patient like that, you think, gosh, they actually really need a labiaplasty for
Yeah.
medical reasons, because you can imagine how, labia minora that are extremely large, like, we're talking like 5 centimeters or maybe even bigger, like 8, or who knows. But
Like an
like,
extra flap of skin, completely
yeah, I mean,
externalized. Yeah. Yeah.
the, the NHS standard, I believe, is 5 centimeters. But at that point, you can imagine maybe they start to cause problems. And so in her case, I can understand doing a labiaplasty, but what's hard to understand is why they remove so much. So this is someone who presumably needed a labiaplasty for medical reasons, and then it looks like completely remove them. And I asked them to please change that part of their textbook, and they didn't, even though they did update the anatomy part of their textbook. So that
Yeah.
was
Yeah. So when I heard your interview with my friend Mark Groves, who put us in touch, I actually got out all of my textbooks
okay.
and I went looking through them. So let's start with the oldest, which is a neurology textbook. No mention of any clitoral, nervous inputs to the clitoris in this very old neurology textbook. So this isn't like something that is just subject to like the contemporary what we're teaching. We've got too much to teach. Let's leave out the anatomy of the clitoris. This is a super old textbook here, when people really spent far more time on the in the age of anatomy. Dissection wasn't even that long ago when this book was published. So they were interested in every little thing, but maybe they missed it. So there's this next book, which is the Abdominal and Pelvic Brain, a book that Paul Chek, a friend of mine, turned me on to. This is a very old book as well. Again, there's no mention of any nervous or venous or blood supply or anything to the clitoris, which is a pretty important part of the body for many women. I'm not going to say everybody cares about their clitoris, but I'd say a lot of people. And then I just picked 3. There's plenty of anatomy books, but this is Frank Netter's book.
It's
And
the
there's
most reliable route to orgasm for 96% of women. And I think even for the rest,
yeah,
it's still important. And I think women who may not realize how important their clitoris is to their sexual function may just not be self-aware.
yeah,
Or
I absolutely agree. And not to knock the OBGYNs too much, but I don't think a lot of them are very much in touch with their sexual beingness. Like it's sort of like this procreation thing. You get pregnant, you had sex, I guess, or whatever. We don't really talk much about the actual stimulation that comes from intercourse or from clitoral play. Like it's almost like a taboo subject, even amongst the gynecologists.
Mhm.
We don't want to talk about it. I don't know why. Like it's just something that isn't important to talk about. So we're going to get into that. But even Netter, every med student on the planet uses Netter, at least in the United States. Not really
Yeah,
much.
so I got
Nothing
them to
special.
update that. Now, which edition of Netter is that?
This is an older one, 4th edition.
What year? Do you know?
Let's see. I will say that there are mentions of it in the back, but there's a difference in illustrating it and actually understanding it as a dynamic thing. Let's see, this one was written in 2003.
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out I have actually been trying to figure out when they added the course of the dorsal nerves in the clitoris, because
Yeah.
those actually were shown in 2018 when I was going through textbooks. Now, but I don't remember them being shown when I checked back when I was in college. One of my professors in
Mm,
college used Netter for his physics of the heart class,
okay.
and I do remember checking it, but then later did find them in Netter, and so when I was contacting them to update their textbook, I was just telling them, "Hey, the course that you have shown is not correct." And um, what was happening is some plastic surgeons were relying on that version of Netter, and they were seeing that basically they showed the nerves turning before they get to the top of the clitoral hood. And so they were assuming that there was a safe zone at the top of the clitoral hood where there is no safe zone.
Oof. I mean,
So
that's really that in my even generic understanding, after having done a little bit of back study, like going back and I don't operate on the clitoris or on the labia. So for me, it's important to know where the nerves and everything else from a childbirth standpoint or from a lot of gynecologic reasons, but I'm not operating there. But if you're operating there, you really should know this. The dorsal side of the clitoris, and what we call the clitoris, what's labeled, is the glands. It's just the tip of the iceberg. There's all this other tissue that runs down the ischiae, along the pubic rami, sort of along that crescent there, and just on the back side of the clitoral body, this, which you could imagine would be like a miniature penis, for lack of better terms, those dorsal nerves up the backside would be right adjacent to the clitoral hood. Is that correct?
yeah, they're right under the clitoral
Yeah,
hood.
right there. Right there.
Um, what's strange is doctors who operate on the clitoral hood, they do not recognize that they're operating basically on the clitoris. You know, they'll say they'll say that they are nowhere near the nerves, which is not true. They'll
Mm,
say the nerves are very deep. They'll say it's not possible to damage the nerves. So this is the information patients are getting, right? And
right.
it's not accurate. So what you have is you have, you know, misinformed consent, and then you also have surgeons operating blind. Um,
Right. Right. Thinking they know because they're using an old edition of Netter or something like that,
or
but they
or even worse, a lot of surgeons, you know, they think that the dorsal nerves of the clitoris arborize prior to the clitoris or as they enter the clitoris. And so they think by the time they are in the external part of the clitoris, they have arborized and
Mm,
they are deep beneath the clitoral hood.
right.
And
Right.
that's not accurate. And one patient actually said that her surgeon said damage to the clitoral body was not possible because it curves back into the body. And that was really alarming because you can feel that that's wrong. You know, like anybody
Yeah.
with a vulva can just feel their own vulva and tell that
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
not right. But unfortunately, pretty much all midline sagittal plane illustrations of the clitoris are incorrect. And I
So it
have
shows
only
it just like a stump, basically, as opposed to the full extent of the body and the crux. Is that right?
um th- it's actually, so I'm not concerned with the crura or the bulbs because they
Mhm.
are very deep, they're internal, they are not at all affected by these external surgeries that surgeons are doing. And you know, I think the emphasis, yeah, I'm not concerned with them as far as my advocacy goes. Um, but basically all the midline sagittal plane illustrations are incorrect. So only the clitoral body and glands are in the midline.
Mm, I
And
see.
what you see is you see, you know, often the clitoral body is truncated or it looks amputated.
Right.
You
Right.
see far less of the clitoris external than there would be external on a normal woman. Often it looks like female genital mutilation, which I find incredibly disturbing.
Yeah.
Um, recently, in December, I believe, this illustration of a pregnant Black woman went viral. It was meant to spread awareness about the need for more representation of, you know, diversity in medical textbooks, and I think that's really important. However, that one was especially bad as far as looking exactly like female genital mutilation. I mean, the
Mm.
clitoris was shown amputated. It was shown basically like cut off flat at the level of the skin. Um, it showed no clitoral hood, and the clitoris is ended before it goes external. And doctors were celebrating it, and nobody commented on how it was incorrect. And I guess it was a bit culturally tone deaf of me to say, "Hey, this looks like female genital mutilation," because everyone was celebrating the illustrator's advocacy. But he later admitted to doing this on purpose to prevent embarrassment. And so I think that's the origin of all this. And he's from Nigeria, so he grew up in a culture that, as far as women's rights are concerned, is behind our country. And so
Yeah.
to us, we all assume that, like, the clitoris is just important anatomy and should be covered and all that. Like I would have assumed that back in the day when I had surgery.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
But I think that's sort of probably how this started, was that, medical illustrators just were uncomfortable showing the full extent of the clitoris, especially the external part, because that's the part that women get pleasure from, and that's why it's taboo. Um, and so, yeah, that's just an example. And because doctors are so used to looking at illustrations that are wrong, they don't they didn't notice an illustration that was even more wrong.
Yeah.
And it was crazy the lengths that some doctors went to defend it. Some said it was off center, even though the urethra and the vagina were right there, which, very clearly indicates it's some mid-sagittal image.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, one was saying it was the clitoris was a pubic bone, and I was just like, What?" I mean, you
Right.
can see a lot of ignorance demonstrated.
Yeah. Okay, so let's structure this your experience in a way because there are a
Okay.
couple of themes here. There's a paucity, there's some void that isn't being met in our medical training. Let's put that as in one canister. The second is the lack of informed consent. Somebody saying, "I can do this for you," and
Mhm.
not really maybe knowing what they're doing. And then the third part is I think the resistance that you've met as you've tried to advocate for improvements on anything under the sun, even if it's just advocating for yourself. I know you've been up against a brick wall, even though you have a highly skilled plastic surgeon as a father. So let's start with the generic question that a lot of people are going to ask, and we're going to be weeding in some anatomy here into this. But the generic question that people ask, and this happens a lot whenever people go to the doctor, they get a surgery, they're not happy with the surgery. Somebody will say something very flippant, and it's because they don't want to actually sit in the pain cave with you and acknowledge that this was a really hard thing to go through. They say, "Well, what did you expect?" So what did you expect? Like, what were you hoping for at that ripe age of 17, 18? What were you hoping for? And why were you at the doctor in the first place? What was it that gave you the impression you needed something to be done?
Well, first of all, I had no insecurities at all at 17 when I first got online. I just did not know what a clitoris was. So at
Yeah.
17, I didn't know what a clitoris was because I had never been taught in sex ed.
Hmm.
So that's the
Hmm.
first problem,
Separate. That's a
that
big
vulvar
problem.
anatomy is not getting taught. And actually, one of my followers has a teenage son, and he was not getting taught about the vulva in sex ed. And so she contacted the school and she said, my son needs to be learning about the vulva. What is going on here? And they said that they only cover reproductive anatomy in sex ed. And so that's the
Ah,
fundamental problem, is that the vulva, including the clitoris, is not considered reproductive. And so one thing I've tried to do is I've tried to argue that it is reproductive, and that denying a reproductive role of the vulva and of the clitoris is a denial of female sexual agency, right? Because,
yeah.
women have sex for pleasure. And if you deny the importance of that, you're denying, the reasons why women have sex, which is what gets us to reproduce. So, so I got online to find out what the clitoris was, and I was trying to find it. I couldn't find it, and I was like, "What the hell?" Because I was googling pictures, and I was like, "I don't think I have one of these." You know what I mean? And then I was
You've got to mirror and you've got Google and you're like, I don't know.
and I was looking at anatomy diagrams. I think one problem is a lot of these anatomy diagrams, they look nothing like a real vulva. A lot of the times the vagina is like gaping open, and mine wasn't like that. Like I look down, I just have a bunch of wrinkly stuff, and I'm like, what the hell? You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And I was like kind of shocked because I'd never really paid attention. And then I got down in front of the mirror and I'm like, this is a fucked up situation.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Doesn't look
uh,
anything like it should.
I mean, I didn't really have an idea of what it should look like, so, but I was just like, this is strange, you
Yeah.
know. But I was also just trying to figure it out. And I was like, where is this clitoris thing I've been hearing about? And I, I ended up on the Wikipedia page for clitoris, and then I ended up on the Wikipedia page for vulva. And I think it was on the vulva Wikipedia page where there was a photo of a vulva that looked nothing like mine. And it was just like totally pink and everything was teeny tiny. Like she had almost no labia minora to speak of. And now that I've seen so many vulvas, I realize like her vulva was like way more like outside of 2 or 3 standard deviations, than
Right.
mine was actually much more typical
Yeah.
than the one that they had on Wikipedia. But I looked at it and I was like, "What?" And I was like, "Is that what other vulvas look like?" And I had never even heard of the word vulva. So I was just super ignorant at this point. And so I started
This
Googling
was like 18, you said 17, 18, or even earlier than that.
17.
Okay.
And yeah, so on the diagram of the vulva on Wikipedia, it said labia minora, and hers were practically non-existent, and mine were, you know, almost an inch long and a little dark and wrinkly. And so I was like, what, you know what I mean? So then I Google, I'm trying to find out what other women's labia look like. And, I remember, I think I just Googled labia minora and I did an image search. And just doing that brought up information about labiaplasty. It brought up labiaplasty advertisements, labiaplasty websites. My memory is it even brought up before and after photos. And so I had never heard of a labiaplasty. It had never occurred to me that I could be abnormal, that I could be ugly. I had never thought about it. And then what happened was I
Oh,
saw
that's so interesting, Jessica. I hadn't really thought about how this all developed in the beginning. I'm so glad to hear it. Continue.
yeah. And so one thing, people always ask, why are women seeking these surgeries? What's going on? And they come up with the most ridiculous reasons, in my opinion, the ridiculous reasons, like bikini waxing and spin class. And I wish that people would consider, just like if OBGYNs would imagine that they are 17 years old and they don't know anything about vulva and they've never seen anybody's vulva but their own, and they just get online and Google labia minora and just like try Googling labia minora and see what comes up. And I think some things have gotten better because, in more recent years, people have published articles like that, vulvas come in all different shapes. And so you'll get more of that today
Yeah.
than I did back then. But you still get, a bunch of information about labiaplasty and how great labiaplasty is and how happy patients are. And um, you know, so what I saw doctors saying that protruding labia minora are hypertrophic.
Right.
And at 17, when I saw hypertrophy, I mean, that sounds like a name for a disease, right? It means excessive growth. It makes it sound like it's a pathology. And they use it to refer to all labia minora that protrude. On Medscape and in some plastic surgery textbooks, use it to refer to labia minora that show at all.
Yeah.
So, um, so that's what I saw. So I saw that they're considered unfeminine and embarrassing, that they cause some women to not want to have oral sex because they're ashamed. And, I saw that they're caused by sexual activity, masturbation, excess androgens, and aging.
Hmm.
Back then, I didn't know what androgens were. So I Googled androgens and I saw, oh, those are male hormones,
Hmm.
right? So
Women have them too, but those are the virilizing hormones. Yeah. If you have too much androgen
So
as a
now
yeah.
I understand that women do have them, but yeah, they say they're caused by excess androgens.
Hmm.
There is no evidence for any of those claims. You know, there's no evidence that they're caused by sexual activity, masturbation, androgens, or aging. In fact, 10 normative studies have been done since I had my surgery, and not one has established a positive correlation between age and labia minora size.
So we're just talking about labia minora right now. That's it. We're not talking
Yeah,
about the
we're just
clitoral
talking about
size or
labia
anything.
minora and
I
how
I had
I
never even heard that that was due to hyperandrogens, but yeah, I'm glad you did all this research.
I mean, that used to be in the ACOG committee opinion. Um, it I mean, it's very widespread. I mean, they make this claim in multiple medical textbooks on Medscape. Um, I forget where else, but this is what I read when I was Googling. And, nowadays I have no shame about my sexual history or the fact that I masturbate. But back then, as a teenager,
Of course.
I who had been taught to not be a slut, I was mortified at the idea that I looked like someone who masturbated all the time, right? And I was
Mhm.
like, "Oh, no, people will think I masturbate." Uh, which now it's like, I don't of course I do, like, but back then I was
Who
mortified and
doesn't?
ashamed. Yeah, and so, um, that's how I became ashamed.
Yeah.
And it had nothing to do with porn. In fact, I wish that I had watched porn. And I really think that people who blame porn for the rise in labiaplasties are misguided. And they're also doing labiaplasty surgeons marketing for them by reinforcing the idea that there is a real beauty standard when, in my opinion, there is not. Right. So I don't think there is a real aesthetic preference. Um,
Well, let me interject with something there because I've been noodling this all day,
okay.
and the reason is that it may have not been the impetus for you going to have. I think most people assume you wanted to look like women in porn, right? Because that's the considered the aesthetic
So I
ideal.
don't agree.
Hear me out though. Hear me out though. I
Okay.
think what I'm saying is that I think people assume that,
Yes, they
and
do. And
then let's
wrong.
imagine. Yeah, I think it's probably. I think that that's probably inaccurate. And as a surgeon, sitting with a woman in stirrups, they're under anesthesia, we're now going to do a labiaplasty. We have to also consider what was it that would prompt a surgeon to operate and to create something from the labia, right? So they have to have some ideal in their head before they start cutting. Otherwise, they're just going haphazardly. So they were trying to get you to look like something in their mind as to what ideal would be. So where did that notion come from? It had to have come from something in the media, pornography or otherwise, for the doctor. Otherwise, what would be guiding their impression that these lips, that the labia minora need to be chopped all the way off? You know what I mean?
Well, first of all, I think my doctor did that by accident.
Hmm.
I got the idea that I didn't want my labia minora to protrude from the medical literature and surgeons' websites where I
Ah,
saw
I see.
protruding labia minora getting called hypertrophic.
Right.
And I
Right.
read that most women want their labia minora to not stick out. And so I told my surgeon I wanted my labia minora to not stick out.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
And in the process of trying to make them not stick out, he completely removed them.
Mm.
I don't think that was his intent. I know that I was the last woman that he did a labiaplasty on, which means that he knew that he messed up.
You messed up. Yeah. Yeah.
But he didn't tell me that, and he never, admitted to messing up. He just said he was surprised at how quote unquote atrophied my labia minora were after my surgery. They did not atrophy. He just,
Yeah. Cut them off. Yeah.
removed.
My lord. Okay. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, I what I did while you were speaking is I just typed labiaplasty into Google. Let's just do a blind search here, and the images are all illustrations. None of them are photos. Interestingly, they're all illustrations of. Oh, there's one photo here, but they're basically every variation of labia minora under the sun before, and then there's one after, which is this kind of pink slit down the middle without any protuberance or protrusion from the you know,
So
beyond the labia majora.
one thing to recognize is that aesthetic standards demonstrated in medical textbooks and in traditional Western art up until very recently, um, they do show the labia minora concealed. And I think this is a function of labia minora being considered taboo. So
Uh-huh.
this more about minimizing explicitness than about a real aesthetic preference. It's sort
I
of
see what you're
about
saying. Yeah.
modesty. And this is also why you tend to see the labia minora tucked in a lot more in softcore porn, like in
Mhm.
magazines like Playboy. This is my understanding. But if you actually get online and look at pornographic videos, you see something much different. And so
Yeah.
when I first saw porn for the first time when I was 21, so I did not actually see porn until I was 21. I saw women who looked just like I did before my surgery. And that's when I first realized that I had been misled.
Yeah.
And so it was porn that made me realize I was totally normal before my surgery
Interesting. Wow.
and that nobody looked like me after my surgery. So, also recently, finally, there is a study that backs up what I've been saying for years and years, and it found that 44% of women in the top pornographic videos on the 5 top porn websites had
Some
had labia
statisticians hard at
minora.
work out there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they got on these porn sites and they looked at the videos and they classified the vulvas. And there were a couple problems with that study, but what they found is that 44% of the women had labia minora longer than the labia majora, and that 36% had labia minora about equal to the labia majora. So that's 80%
Yeah.
of these top porn videos show what Medscape defines as hypertrophy.
Wow.
So now,
Huh.
so th- what they found is, they found about the same numbers as were found by this Gynodiversity project, which is very, very helpful. I don't know if any OBGYNs listen to this podcast, but if they do, if any patients are insecure, referring them to the Gynodiversity project will help them a ton because what it does is it breaks down, just all the types of vulvas that are out there. It goes over all of the colors that vulvas come in, just all the different shapes and everything. And it breaks it down. It says like this percentage of women are like this and this like that. And that was the information that I was looking for at 17 and never found. Um, but so this study of women in porn found about the same numbers, except actually the study of women in porn found that the women had even larger labia minora. And I think this can be explained by the fact that when women are aroused, their labia minora, they swell with blood and that could make them stick out more. And I
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
actually, like, I've seen some women comment on like my TikToks and Instagram posts. Some women, they have quote unquote innies, like normally. And then when
Yeah.
they're aroused, then they have an outie. So, some women are kind of like in between innies and outies,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like they're a
Like,
grower, not a
yeah,
shower kind of thing.
yeah, it's funny because there has been this discussion, like, are you an innie and are you an outie? And so it's really funny when you see the women who are like, I am both. You know what I mean? It's funny.
Wow, that is really interesting. Yeah. I'm still stuck on the fact that somebody did all this research on Pornhub looking at labia minora. I mean, that's really pretty fascinating. And I did just look up the Gynodiversity Project. I'm going to buy their book because it's basically a collection of selfies of the vulva. It looks like.
But yeah,
And
the other thing,
yeah, go
so
ahead.
this particular study looked at 5 different porn sites, which I'm sure included Pornhub. But just speaking of Pornhub, I guess in 2019, Pornhub users voted on the nicest pussy, and they voted on a woman named Elsa Jean, who has very large labia minora.
Let me
So
see.
her labia minora are bigger than most labia minora you will find on, say, Dr. Gary Alter's website. He's a specialist in labiaplasty, and most of his patients before labiaplasty have smaller labia minora than she does.
Yeah.
This is the vulva that men voted was the nicest. So I just this is why I think that the aesthetic standard being pushed, it's not representative of men's preferences. And I try to emphasize this a lot because I think that, you know, blaming men doesn't make sense, blaming porn doesn't make sense. And when you do that, you actually reinforce this idea that there is a real beauty standard, right? That there is,
Right.
you know, um, that there is a real preference. And I don't think that there is now. Some men do have preferences. Like some men prefer innies and they don't like outies. And
Right.
and some men prefer outies and they don't like innies. So there was actually a woman on my TikToks who was getting upset. She started ranting and she said, "You're
Somebody
wrong."
ranting on TikTok? No.
There's always, you know. But she was upset because she was like, "No, no, men make fun of vulvas that men make fun of innies. Men make fun of women who only have a line. They only, you know."
Hmm.
And I'm like, "Really?" And she's like, "Yeah, they call it no clit something." I forget. Like she was saying that they had like derogatory names for
Yeah.
women who didn't have anything showing. And I was like, "This is a new one." And she was up she was upset because she thought I had it all wrong. She's like, "You're wrong. Actually, nobody's ever preferred innies." And I'm like, "This is a new story, but here's a woman who has felt shamed for not having anything showing." And I think that the common theme here is not so much that there is a real preference, because I think, men like all different types, but rather that this is an extremely sensitive area
Oh,
for women.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it's an area where a lot of women, we don't know what's going on. And so we're super, super vulnerable to any kind of criticism. And I think it's such an intimate thing that it's like, it's a way to hurt us. If anybody wants to hurt a woman's feelings, they can talk shit about her vulva. One time I was talking to a misogynist on Twitter, which was a mistake because, like, I don't need to be, getting myself riled up. But, but
Misogyny on Twitter. I mean, I keep coming up with these like t-shirt ideas. Yeah,
I
it's
mean, this guy was frightening because he has like 77,000 followers, and a lot of them are tech CEOs and venture capitalists, and he's
gee, oh man.
a Teal fellow.
Yeah.
So this is why I was like, I saw him and I was like, what is going on with this man? Because he referred to women as roasties. And I said, "Hi, I'm not sure if you're aware, but this term hurts a lot of women's feelings. And there's nothing wrong with labia minora that look like roast beef, right?" and 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 he said, "Well, I'm just trying to shame promiscuous women." And I said, "Well, uh anyway, I didn't really get into like how obviously like slut shaming is wrong. And instead I said,
Yeah.
"Well, did you know that there's actually no correlation between, you know, labia minora looking like roast beef and promiscuity, right? That's not actually a sign of promiscuity. It's just, this is just a function of genetics and hormones." And he said, "Yeah, but it makes women feel bad." And I'm like, "Well, oh, so that literally is the goal for
Yeah, I
him." And I
just want you to
said,
feel inferior in any way. I'll just grab it,
and
even the low-hanging fruit.
I asked him, I said, "Do you actually have a problem with labia minora that look like that?" Like at one point he said, "I have no problem with labia minora looking like roast beef or sticking out or anything like that. That's not what this is about. I'm just trying to make promiscuous women feel bad." And I'm like, this is fucked. But
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I think that sometimes like women need to realize like sometimes when people say derogatory things, they're just trying to be mean.
Yeah.
Like it's like that's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't even necessarily mean that they have a problem with it. Like what people do is they look for areas where people are vulnerable. Like if you want to hurt someone, you look for where they're vulnerable and you hit that thing, right? And so I think that's why, and I think this is an area where women are vulnerable, and that's why you see derogatory language about it. And another thing that I've tried to raise awareness about on TikTok, and the video I made was really popular, and I didn't realize it. Sometimes my TikTok gets ridiculous. Sometimes I just start talking, and then it just like something will go viral, and I'm like, well, that was surprising. And
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen some of your videos. I'm like, oh wow, Jessica has this, whoa, like a lot of hits on this video. And it's like not what I would expected from a million hits or something like that. Yeah.
me neither. And then sometimes I like put effort in, and it's not popular, so I just sort
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
whatever. Anyway, um, with this one video, um, I was trying to say that it's not always bad if men call um, labia minora roast beef or Arby's or anything like that. Like, it's not necessarily an insult, or it's not necessarily meant as an insult. And someone will argue it's always derogatory and they just shouldn't say it. And that may be right. You know, that it may be ideal if men would just stop using that sort of language. However, I do think it's important to recognize intent before you decide to get upset and, interpret the meaning of something, right? So, like, a lot of the times you see, like if you get on Reddit, the top pussy pic on Reddit is a very meaty outie. And
Yeah.
in the comments, you see a lot of references to beef and burgers and meat and Arby's, but it's all complimentary. And this literally has the most, or at least last I checked, this was the vulva with the most likes. You
This
know?
is sort of like the Elsa Jean or whatever you had said of Reddit. Here, this is the
Yeah.
picture we like the most. Yeah.
I mean, and I'm not saying that innies are bad, because there are obviously, photos of innies that are very popular as well. And I sometimes I think maybe outies are more polarizing, right?
Right. And probably because, again, if you type in a picture, even if a layperson types in a picture on Google, I don't do pelvic surgery anymore. But if I were going to do this, I would want to know the anatomy. Well, you go to Google and you're seeing this sort of innie picture. You're seeing
Yeah.
this is what your job as the surgeon, your job is to create this. And
Mhm.
so you then put your tools into play to make that happen. So even a layperson going on and looking at images online, you're going to see that, oh, maybe there is an ideal. Like it can be there's a lot of cognitive dissonance there, where no matter
Yeah.
what you actually feel or what your experience is, oh, there's actually a normal, quote, normal or whatever. And it's neither common nor normal from what you're saying.
I mean, innies are normal and common as well.
Yeah.
Like, according to the Gynodiversity project, 27% of women have vulvas that are complete innies with nothing showing at all. And then I forget how many, but there's some odd percentage of women who have just labia minora that stick out the bottom, and so they can kind of look like innies.
Yeah.
But then if you look closer, it's like but they're almost innies, and then anyway, so the Gynodiversity project really breaks it down. But so it is fairly common, but it's also common to have labia minora that stick out, and there's nothing wrong with it.
Of
So,
course. Yeah.
like, when I was 17, after I looked online, I got the impression that the vast majority of women had labia minora that didn't show at all, and that's what I was, quote unquote, supposed to look like.
Right.
And I just think it's important that women understand that that's not the case, and that, there's nothing wrong with labia minora that stick out. And also, just what I was saying before is that, so in the video that was very popular, I said, men are gross. They're just going to say gross things, like, they're but I said, they will eat the beef. Don't worry about it.
I remember seeing that video, Jessica, and I was like, oh man, I have to interview her. And we had already set up a time, and I was like, I
know?
bet this is going to come up. And here we are talking about Arby's and roast beef. I was like,
Yeah, but I just
yeah, it was a lot.
so many girls say that is what makes them feel insecure. And
Yeah.
I know that when I was 17 and I saw that reference, when I saw roast beef, I was like, "Ew, how can they be calling like my vulva roast beef?" But it's actually like, if you take a step back and you really think about it, and you think about like dudes, like, they're not going to say that they look like butterfly wings and flowers because they're men.
We're just you're just Neanderthals over here trying to create bad metaphors. I want to qualify something real quick that I said, and that is, of course, through the Gynodiversity project and through your work and whatnot. I think everybody needs to take a step back and realize that however your vulva looks, there's very, very few medical reasons to alter it. There's going to be somebody out there, a large portion of people likely, who appreciate the way that your vulva naturally looks. So when I use the word common, we use these words in medicine a lot, where we say, oh, it's normal, not common, normal. It's normal to have really, really painful periods. It's just a part of being a woman. Well, it might be common, but it's not necessarily normal. In other words, there might be something there to fix. I don't think, I just want to put my flag in the ground. I don't think that there's anything to be fixed about a vulva that is shaped a little bit differently than the first image that pops up online, or even the most popular image on Reddit or whatever else. I think that we need to get away from that. And I do think men are feeding into this hypocrisy of being, of wanting to be validated for who they are, for their small penis or whatever else, yet they're willing to use language like roast beef and Arby's. Like, I do think that there's good reason for us to be like, can you guys fucking stop it? Like, I don't care what your intention is. It's just not nice to talk about a person's body. They can't change
Yeah.
it unless they go to a surgeon who then potentially messes them up and they now no longer have clitoral sensation.
Yeah, I also think the way that there's so much variance in vulvar morphology means that I guess like sexual selection didn't really act strongly on it. Like there hasn't been a lot of pressure on vulvar aesthetics because it hasn't really mattered or
Yeah,
because there is this, diversity in preferences. And
sure.
there was this one study that looked at, what men liked and disliked about vulvas. And one of the things that men said they liked is just the variety. Like,
Oh,
I mean, I think that's like it's nice that they're unique, right? It can be nice that, you know, whatever your vulva looks like, it's unique. It may not look like another vulva exactly, right? And there's actually something special about that. Um, but yeah, one thing that I wanted to mention is in a recent study in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, a plastic surgeon found that physical complaints were not correlated with objective labia minora
uh-huh.
size.
Uh-huh. So what are some of those physical complaints that they were looking at? I was actually going to ask you this next. So this is a nice segue.
Well, I guess women will complain about their labia minora bothering them in sports, in tight pants, uh, bike riding.
Kind of just like a chafing process,
I
for lack
guess
of a
so.
better term.
I have tried to understand this. I'm not entirely clear on how this works. I never had symptoms. However, I did tell my doctor that I had pain when I rode my bike.
Hmm.
Um, and that was one thing that made it very hard for me to stand up for myself later. And that was one thing that caused me to blame myself for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Because I did not have pain when I rode my bike. I just said that because it seemed like no one would listen to me and like I couldn't just like I had to say that I had a reason.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that that is something that doctors maybe should be aware of that
Maybe.
that young women like teenagers might just be desperate to have surgery and might be saying stuff that
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know and also if the problem is just uncomfortable in certain types of underwear or certain types of pants or bike seats then those underwear can change you
Yeah.
know the
Yeah,
pants
yeah, right.
can change.
I can't
you know
put
i
your clitoris back together.
I could have gotten a new bike seat. They have bike seats that are specifically made for women. They're
Yeah.
shaped differently. They have like a little dent or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And that was never suggested, right?
Yeah.
So in this study, they found that the most common physical complaint was complaints of pain during sex or discomfort during sex, right? And so the fact that the most common physical complaints are sexual complaints sets off some alarm bells, right? For me
Mm-hmm.
at least,
Mm-hmm.
especially given that he found that physical complaints were not correlated with labia minora size, right?
Right.
And it is very difficult to try and say that labia minora size is causing those complaints when there's not even a correlation,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because what
Especially if it's going to lead to surgery, similar to like with endometriosis. You're going to get all of your uterus taken out, and now you're going to have pelvic pain. Well, turns out a great number of women still have pelvic pain. We've done the surgery, but is that surgery actually going to provide you with the relief? The same goes for this study. Fortunately, they're actually looking at they can actually measure the size of the labia. So I think that's an important consideration.
yeah, so the lack of correlation indicates that at least most of the time women are complaining about their labia minora causing them problems. It is very unlikely to be a function of the size, right?
Mm-hmm.
So more likely it is something else. And given that they're mostly sexual complaints, I think that, it may be an arousal problem. And I actually talked to a woman who contacted me asking for a recommendation for a safe surgeon because sometimes women do that. And I will try to help women who I think, have a legitimate reason for wanting surgery. And so I personally am against cosmetic labiaplasty, given the lack of training standards and given the way that misinformation is used to promote these surgeries. Um, but if I obviously don't want anyone to suffer, and I don't want anyone to get harmed. And so, but with this woman, I was just sort of asking her what symptoms she had, and I asked her, I said, "Do you have this problem when you're aroused?" And she said, "No." And then she said it was unreasonable to expect her to be aroused every time she has sex.
Oh my
And I was like,
God.
"What? What?" So so there's this, um so, or and
I'm sort of speechless. Sorry, I'm gonna collect myself here, Jessica. You carry on.
but I think that there's really something there. Like,
Yeah,
there's this idea that women should just be ready to be penetrated right away, when that's not how it works. Like, you know, and I've talked to guys, and a lot of guys really intuitively understand that the way to get a woman ready for penetration is to stimulate her vulva,
right.
right? And and TMI, this is always a little trickier for me because of my whole situation. And what it means is that, like this one guy did, he said, "I can't use my go-to moves with you, and it's really hard." And it's like, yeah, I'm sorry. Like, he has go-to moves, and
The
because
old flint flicker or something, that he's gonna use his. Yeah, I get you.
they typically, well, I think it's very intuitive. And when I think about my sexual experiences back before I had surgery, I don't know what other people's early sexual experiences were like, but I feel like it was very intuitive to just rub on the outside,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's what we did.
Like
And
dry humping was like game changing when you were met somebody that you wanted to be, explore with, but you weren't ready to
yeah,
have sex. It was just like, we're gonna get the juices flowing. Like that is the
yeah,
process that's
it
lacking.
worked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so it's really sad that I had that experience. And I thought that that was like just, you know, foreplay and not the real deal. And
mm,
I thought, someday when I had penetrative sex, like fireworks were gonna go off, and that
yeah,
there was something magical up my
right,
vagina somewhere I
right.
couldn't find it. You know what I mean? That only a penis could reach. And
A
this is
magic wand, so to speak.
this is
Yeah,
total bullshit.
yeah,
Total
yeah,
bullshit. And so, it's really sad as I lost sensation in my surgery. And that is what caused me to decide to have sex, right? Because I thought this is how I will solve the problem of the fact that I no longer have fun with these activities anymore.
yeah,
Um, and then that didn't really work out. And then I was like, this boy is clearly incompetent. Moving on.
yeah,
Just
yeah, yeah,
the way, like, I was in so much denial. I mean,
yeah.
it's funny and it's sad because, um,
And you were
but
like still like 19, 20 years old, right? You were super
I was
young.
18 at that point.
Oh, okay.
Uh, but what's sad is I found a Reddit comment from a 16-year-old who has the same she's going through the same thing. Like, because she said, she lost clitoral sensation, she can no longer orgasm from external stimulation, but she assumes she'll still be able to orgasm from penetration
Penetration. The vast majority of women,
someday.
far as the last time I looked, requires direct clitoral stimulation in order to orgasm. Why don't we get into that topic?
Yeah.
Because there's also some important reasons to have the clitoris still operational and orgasms, possible. But it isn't just the clitoris. But let's pause there for a second, because did you say that young woman was 16?
Yeah.
So
So the
here,
other thing is about a third of the women who have contacted me who have been harmed, were they were minors at the time of their surgery. So I think, you know, probably I don't know. I sometimes I think minors are the most vulnerable and most likely to get operated on by
Yeah.
surgeons who haven't been trained. Because I think more adult women seeking labiaplasty are probably more careful and more, um, they know their bodies better. They know how to, I don't know, keep themselves safe a little bit better.
Well,
Um,
they're adults.
and
They're
I also,
adults.
yeah, and also there's this doctor, Dr. Michael Goodman, who he first wrote an article, I think back in 2010 or 2011, saying that the field of female genital cosmetic surgery was the wild, wild west. And he was the first doctor who tried to say, hey, surgeons are, they're doing surgeries they're not trained to do on anatomy they don't know. And this is a problem. And, something needs to be done to get surgeons trained because they're hurting people,
Yeah.
right? And he
Yeah.
says that the most common scenario he sees where women have been harmed are when they get operated on by a general OBGYN for quote unquote medical reasons. So
Okay.
that is the highest risk scenario, and
So
and I think that that's the one that the underage women are most often, in, right?
yeah, let's pause because there's a committee opinion from ACOG about this specifically, exactly what you're talking about. And it's talking about breast and labial surgery in adolescents. This is the one I think you were referring to before. And there is a big paragraph here that's important. Surgical correction labiaplasty in girls younger than 18 years should be considered only in those with significant congenital malformation or persistent symptoms that the physician believes are caused directly by labial anatomy or both. Physicians should be aware that surgical alteration of the labia that is not necessary to the health of the adolescent who is younger than 18 age is a violation of federal criminal law.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they
So,
say, but the reality is, there was one girl who was 12 and her surgeon suggested it, you know, and
oh,
her mom.
I'm not defending ACOG here at all.
Sorry,
I'm not saying,
sorry,
hey,
sorry.
how could this be happening? I'm saying this is happening and there isn't a lot of informed consent or a process taking place here that would warrant so many women going through this procedure.
Yeah, also ACOG is very much leaving it up to the discretion of the provider. There's a lot of flexibility there. Someone like me coming in now, my doctor, he actually did wait until I turned 18, you know, for because he didn't want to get sued. You know what I mean? And I
Right,
definitely
right.
would have sued the fuck out of him if he
And
or
and
I
he
would have.
wasn't a plastic surgeon, he was an OBGYN, right?
Yeah. So like if I had had surgery just a few days prior, then I think I would have, because of female genital mutilation laws, I would have had a lot longer to try and, do something.
Yeah, yeah.
uh, but basically, but I still, I mean, when I have talked to women who were operated on super young, they were not told risks. They
Yeah.
were not aware of their bodies. They in retrospect don't really think that they needed surgery. It was more just like somebody, they like maybe they complain, but they don't really understand, you know. Um,
Mm,
like like I said, like if somebody has discomfort in pants, you can change the pants. So if some
right.
15-year-old is
Seat,
like,
whatever.
if some 15-year-old is like, my labia minora are uncomfortable, it's like there sometimes are other things that can be done. And like I definitely talked to one woman who said that yeah, she wishes someone had thought of another bike seat, you know. Um and also I've seen like girls on TikTok who haven't had surgery who said, my OBGYN helped me pick more comfortable underwear. And I
Yeah,
think that that's the sort of thing that should be happening.
yeah, yeah.
There is one I don't know if you've seen that woman, Gabby. She has
On TikTok?
an underwear line made especially for, I guess, like,
Oh my God. I haven't
beefy
seen this.
vulva.
Can you send me a link to that later? Because maybe we'll
Yeah,
reach out to
yeah,
her
yeah,
and
I
see
will.
if she
She
wants
is
to,
great. She is super popular, and, um, yeah, she's just, she made one video where she explained the difference between an innie and an outie, and she's like, "And
I don't
this is
know.
what
I
I
don't
have."
spend enough time on TikTok, on woke TikTok. Yeah. But she has a whole product line. Yeah, that it is amazing that there's a more of a grassroots effort for us to have some justice within the system through the lens of this lack of informed consent, which is a topic I definitely want to touch on, because when a person comes to you for surgery, they may demand surgery, and you as the surgeon can say, no, I don't think that's the right thing to do. I'm happy to refer you out. When a person
Yeah.
does come and say, I want to do this thing, it's your job is to provide risks, benefits, alternatives, and that to really understand the surgery that you're proposing, that you do. And a lot of that is being lost. It's lost with C-section, everything up from C-section to circumcision to obviously labiaplasty. So,
Yeah,
um,
so my
yeah,
doctor didn't talk to me about risks at all. Um, all he said was, all surgery carries risks. That's all he said. And my
wow,
consent form was a fill in the blank consent form that said excision of redundant labia. And I'm pretty sure all it said, like it was fill in the blank. So it was not specific to the surgery I was having. So all surgery carries risks was sort of just this blanket statement that meant practically nothing. And I actually did a lot to try and figure out if there were any risks, right? So, I did look at outcome studies published at the time. I did, try and find out if the labia minora played any role in sexual function. You know, I pinched them and was like, are they like this is not a reliable way to test sensitivity.
yeah, yeah.
Like I didn't really know what I was doing. I just pinched them. I'm like, these are how much does it hurt? Like, anyway, I would never have had surgery if I thought there was any risk
Yeah,
to
yeah,
sexual function. Never. That is not a risk that I ever would have taken. And I think people assume that I knowingly took that risk, and I definitely did not.
mm,
One thing very disturbing is so in 2018, I passed out flyers at the ACOG annual meeting, the annual meeting for the American College of OBGYNs. And on the front of my flyers, it said, help improve OBGYN education and clitoral anatomy. And I went through how the nerves in the clitoris were missing from OBGYN literature. They were missing from textbooks and they weren't in OBGYN journals. And, I said, this indicates that OBGYNs don't know this anatomy and they should because, here is how it affects patients. And so that was on one side. And on the other side, it said, I think it said 77%. I think that was a typo because I looked at the study again. And so there was a survey study of OBGYNs that found 78% of OBGYNs would offer labiaplasty to a patient they thought had hypertrophy. Um,
wow,
and 45% of the OBGYNs who responded to this survey were pediatric OBGYNs. So what that
mhm,
means is a lot of the pediatric OBGYNs are saying that they would offer labiaplasty. And it's hard to say whether, like, they didn't clarify whether offer labiaplasty meant refer to somebody else or do it yourself. But I think a lot of OBGYNs are doing these without training.
yeah,
And I was happy. There was one OBGYN I talked to at the ACOG annual meeting, and she said, yeah, everybody is doing these, and I know they're not trained. And this was 2018. And definitely back in the day, like in 2010, I talked to a plastic surgeon about a repair. And that plastic surgeon, he's the top expert in labiaplasty in the world. And he has published in the aesthetic surgery journal, which is basically the top cosmetic surgery journal in the world, that there is no evidence the labia minora play a role in sexual function.
oh
And
my God,
that is not true. And so the fact that this is the information patients are getting is so problematic.
yeah,
And so he's the top expert in labiaplasty in the world. And I was talking to him and I was trying to figure out whether having new labia minora made could help my function. I was just trying to come up with anything. I didn't know what I was doing. Okay. But I actually do think that the labia minora do play a role in facilitating stimulation of the clitoris. And nobody ever really talks about that, even though that was actually Masters and Johnson's explanation for how women had orgasms from penetration alone. Their explanation was that it's indirect clitoral stimulation caused by, basically tension on the labia minora. Except recently I talked to a woman who, you know, she was her vulva got damaged in childbirth, and she was like she's actually super smart.
Mm.
It's funny because I think she's like an esthetician, right? She's not, she like waxes women for a living. So I think it makes her very comfortable with vulvas. But like the way her understanding of all this and her insight is so good.
Mm.
Um, but she said, anyway, she was telling me like how the way that things pull, it definitely causes the clitoris to be stimulated. And she said, and this is also how women can, do kegels and they can kegel themselves to an orgasm. It's because of how the vulva and the clitoris move when they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, wow, you're right. You know, so basically there's a lot of belief that the labia minora don't really have any function. When I before my surgery, I did ask my doctor. I said, "What is the?" Or I said, "What do the labia minora do? Like, what are they for?" And he just shrugged. He had no answer for me. And so if I thought, they had some important purpose, I would have been a little bit more worried. Um, and Yeah, and I've seen there's one OBGYN who has she specializes in female genital cosmetic surgery in Houston. She wrote this paper where she said she didn't know where anyone got the idea that the labia minora play a role in sexual function.
She said she didn't know where, like, that's
Didn't know
preposterous.
where anyone got that idea. It's obviously wrong. Yeah. She also said that doctors should not use the terms labia minora and vulva because they might confuse patients. She also said her patients are obviously savvy enough to know what normal vulvas look like, and they can make their own decisions. So it's like, okay, you think that your patients are so ignorant, they don't know basic anatomical terms, but they're definitely educated enough to know what vulvas look like, and there's no need to, like, make sure that they know. Like, this
And
lady.
their experience with having a vulva and a vagina and having sex would probably also tell them that there is some stimulation, there is some pleasure to be had with even touching the labia minora in an intimate way.
Yeah, so
So,
part of the problem is I think that people, and I've talked to other women who said this as well, who had the same experience. It's like, okay, so we have this knowledge of our own bodies, but when we are told by an authority that we're wrong, it it gets hard to believe ourselves. Does that make sense? Like, so I
absolutely it does. It happens all over the birth world.
I
Right?
was a teenager, like I'm like 17, and
Mm.
when I would get touched down there or whatever, obviously I had a lot of sensations. And I couldn't even find my clitoris. So I only had like a vague idea of like you touch that area and the whole area is like tingly,
Yeah.
and it was more like my understanding of what was going on was sort of diffuse. Like instead of focused on like one point, it was like everything, you know. And so when I got online and I read doctors say labia minora don't play a role in sexual function, I was confused,
Yeah.
but I also didn't trust myself enough to say, "I'm right and the doctor is wrong."
Yeah.
Right? So that level of audacity came later. You know you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Nowadays people are like, "How dare you say the doctors are wrong?" I'm like, "But they are." Like, I
Yeah.
do know better than most doctors, Like, I say that, and then people accuse me of being a narcissist, and I'm like, I'm just correct." But at 17, I had no ability, if I saw the experts say something, I went with that over my own knowledge of my own body, my own experience. Um,
Yeah. One thing that's coming up for me is that even how we OBGYNs don't like talking about sex, even though we're dealing with the consequence of sex, whether it be STIs or babies or, whatever, like this is our domain. HPV, I mean, like all these other topics, but I'm not exactly sure why medicine has become so devoid. Like if any taboo subject can be unpacked, it should be through the lens of our medical scientists. I'm using air quotes here. So why aren't OBGYNs more interested in the physiology and the anatomy of sexual pleasure? Instead we pass out lubes and things, and it's like dawning on me that if you need lube, you're not doing it, for many people, unless there's like some absolute reason that lubrication is needed. Most women are going to have natural lubrication if, as my wife always tells me, sex is the
They just get
consequence
stimulated
of,
enough.
of intimacy. Exactly. Yeah. It's not the goal is not let's stick a penis in the vagina. The goal is let's get so revved up that naturally the consequences that we're going to be connecting with, my penis inside of you. So it's almost like the conversation, we are so far behind in the OBGYN and the medical community. We're not even willing to go there and talk about sexual pleasure or arousal. Instead, we just say, oh, use some lube, or, oh, it's in your head. Can you elaborate on what they told you about whenever you said, I can't feel anything up in this area? And they kind of gaslighted you. What did they actually say about, you just need to find the right person and all that? Can
They
you,
said my surgery could not have affected my sexual function. They told me to see a sex therapist. They told me I probably just needed to relax. And one OBGYN said I just needed to fall in love.
but you still had a drive. You were just saying something's not right and anatomically, right?
Yeah, well, so my sex drive actually got much higher once I figured out how to still have an orgasm with a vibrator.
Hmm.
And so one thing that I find very frustrating about how medicine approaches female sexual dysfunction is they act like, stimulation and desire are separate, right? So they always say that the most common female sexual dysfunction is desire disorder, and I think this is
Yeah,
the
yeah.
biggest crock of shit. You know what I mean? Because sorry, but like there is actually one doctor who agrees with me. Her name is Dr. Teresa Wood. She's on Instagram. She talks about how a lot of the time, like if women come in and they don't have sexual desire, it's literally because they're not having good sex. They don't want
Yeah,
sex
yeah.
if it's not pleasurable. And like the solution to improving desire is just to make sex more desirable. Like it's a feedback
Right,
system.
right.
It's pretty
Yeah,
obvious.
yeah,
It is interesting that I did still have, I mean, I like so I guess some sex drive is like intrinsic, I guess, a function of hormones or whatever. And then some of it comes from that feedback, right? So I still had it even when I wasn't getting as much feedback, but not as much as, once I figured out how to, use a vibrator. But like for me, I mean TMI, but I have so little sensation.
I
It's
think
more
we're
like
past TMI here.
more
It's
like I I have like an engineering brain. My degree is in biomedical engineering. So when it came to figuring out how to have an orgasm despite what happened to me, it was like, I'm gonna engineer this shit. You know what I mean? It was like kind of like not accepting no for an answer. And I try to tell other women who have been harmed this because there is a tendency to sort of give up. And what I will say to anyone who has lost sensation for whatever reason, be it in childbirth or anything, or there are a lot of women out there that we tend to forget about who were operated on as children, as infants, right? And with
yeah.
these intersex surgeries,
Mhm.
and like they don't have normal sensation at all, right? And I guess what I try to tell people, anyone who might find themselves in a similar position that I was in, I've been in, is like, if something doesn't work, just keep trying. You know what I mean? Like, so
Yeah.
that might mean like trying like 20 vibrators. It might mean like, just keep trying. Because I mean that's kind of how I approached it. But yeah, so things have all I was saying is like things have changed for me as far as my ability to connect with partners, my ability, my desire for sex, just everything. It affects
Yeah.
so much. And it's crazy how it's crazy how people disconnect sexual pleasure from reproduction when it comes to females.
Yeah.
And y- like you see this on so many levels, like not just in medicine, but like you see it in like I saw it in *Sapiens*, that book *Sapiens* by
Yeah.
Yuval
Uh-huh.
Harari. He
Uh-huh.
spent a whole paragraph talking about how males would not bother to reproduce unless it was pleasurable for them. But there tends to be an assumption that female sexual pleasure has not been evolutionarily relevant. And
Wow.
there's this woman who wrote a whole book arguing that the clitoris is vestigial, right?
Yeah, that word vestigial. Yeah. Yeah.
Like
For people who don't know the word, it basically means it's a relic. It's a remnant from some leftover
that is
previously
just
useful organ or something.
that is just a byproduct of the fact that males need to have pleasure.
Yeah.
Like, people argue that female orgasm serves no function, but, like, literally, oxytocin levels more than double, um, when women orgasm during sex, and they don't change much at all when women don't. And oxytocin is the bonding hormone.
Hmm.
So, like, and this is so obvious. And if you, like, for women who have suffered damage, the connection is obvious, right? For women who know, like, the before and after,
Yeah.
you know. And I actually don't know it as well because, but actually with me, anyway, it has I feel like being able to have workarounds help me. But, like, there's one woman who contacted me recently, and she said, "I feel like I can't bond anymore," right?
Oh,
And another woman who lost clitoral sensation in childbirth, she said, "Yeah, it makes it hard for her to wanna have penetrative sex," right? So people separate clitoral
mm,
stimulation from penetrative sex, and I've noticed that women like, women get mad at me for saying the clitoris is reproductive. They're like, "Why can't pleasure be good enough on its own?" Because, like, evolution does not like, it
there's no
doesn't
mistake.
select for
Yeah.
pleasure. Pleasure isn't like the endpoint. The goal is not for us to have a good time. Like, you know what I mean? That's not the
Right.
goal of
Yeah.
evolution.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's
Um,
an important question, and you actually highlighted this on maybe on TikTok or Instagram, but the role of
yeah.
oxytocin in sperm motility, right?
Oh, yeah, that too.
That's an
Yeah.
awesome study. I checked it out.
And what was crazy, yeah, there were a couple studies I found, and what was crazy is they never said orgasm. They said, like, one of the papers
Hmm.
said oxytocin from vaginal stimulation during penetration. And I was like, "Bro, we're not even talking about the vagina here." Like,
Mm.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. 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 Which is where
it's
we all go. We immediately go to vagina, cervix, uterus, tubes, ovaries. What about the vulva and the clitoris? Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm. I mean, when I hear you speak about these things, it makes so much sense, but it's also very confronting, I think, for OBGYNs to have to acknowledge that there's this whole body of, of, I don't know, even just conversation that could be had that would improve the care of their patients. This is if you want this to be your domain, you should know your domain through and through. We should be listening to
Yeah.
people like you in order to adjust our practices, or maybe not offering a procedure we're not trained to do. We're not trained to do them.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Speaking of, so what I was trying to say earlier when I talked about passing out flyers at the ACOG annual meeting
oh yeah.
was on the other side of the flyer. So on one side it said, help get clitoral anatomy taught, basically. And then on the other side, it said 77% of OBGYNs, but actually the paper says 78. I think it was a misquote, but it's like 1%, who cares? So, so 78% of OBGYNs said that they would offer labioplasty. And then I said, why doesn't ACOG offer CME for these? So you said that labioplasty was covered in your residency, but you were just recently a resident, right?
uh 5 years ago. Yeah, but it wasn't really covered. I mean, to say it's covered gets into the conversation around board certification. If you're getting privileges to do a procedure that you've seen a couple times, that's not really being trained to do it, because to train to do it would require us to understand the nervous supply, arterial, venous supply, the entire anatomy of that. And everything we've already talked about is it's clear that people don't appreciate it because it's taboo to get into
Yeah.
the organs of
So
sexual
you,
pleasure. Yeah.
even just that exposure that you had, I guarantee you that's way more than my surgeon ever had, right?
Yeah,
Um,
you might be right. Yeah,
More
you
than
might be
most
right.
do. That
Yeah.
surgeon in Houston, I told you about that paper she wrote. She also talked about dodging bullets with her first dozen or so patients because
Huh.
what happens is surgeons start doing these because they think it looks
Uh,
easy. There was one OBGYN who called my dad one time asking if he does labiaplasties, and after he told her he doesn't, she said, "Well, do you think I could just do it? It looks easy." That's how they
It
start
was an
doing it.
OBGYN that reached out to him?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And he was like, "Please don't." But that's how they start doing these. They think that it's just extra skin. If you look at, for example, Baggish Atlas of Pelvic Anatomy and Gynecologic Surgery, um, when it describes how to do a labiaplasty, it calls the quote unquote excess labia minora excess skin. And in the diagram showing you how to do it, it pretty much shows, I mean, I would say it shows how to completely remove the labia minora, right? It,
Yeah.
it doesn't say make sure you leave at least a centimeter, right? Or two, even. Because realistically, if you're actually just doing a labiaplasty for medical reasons, why would you need to remove, why would you not be able to leave 2 centimeters? Because
Yeah.
that's like a normal size, right? Like that was the average, 2.18 was the average found in one study. So, what is the need for teeny tiny labia minora if we're really talking about medical labiaplasty,
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
So, that's a thing that's crazy, and that's what, like, a long time ago, I wrote this paper where I tried to explain all the reasons why what happened to me happened, and at one point I said, "My surgeon had to have a surgical goal that of labia minora smaller than his margin of error," right? So, is he really such an incompetent surgeon that he fucked up by 2 centimeters?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right.
Or was he trying to make my labia minora unreasonably small, and he also made a technical error, right? So it's both. And if you yeah, so and if you really can't control yourself by 2 centimeters, then then, like,
Might be time to
you're
retire your scalpel, I'd say.
yeah, or allow, I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's just crazy to think about.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so on my flyers, I said that ACOG should offer continuing medical education. And that guy I mentioned earlier, Dr. Michael Goodman, he told me he had tried to get ACOG to offer continuing medical education and that they had refused. And they refused because they don't want to be associated with these procedures because they're taboo. So, like, taboo is affecting this on all different levels.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
taboo is preventing anatomy from being taught. It's causing all the stigma, right? It's making women vulnerable to negative messaging. And it's also preventing professional medical organizations from establishing training standards and from dictating that anatomy be taught. Um,
Yeah. I mean, it should force us to consider where do these taboos come from, and if you go back several hundred centuries, a woman's sexuality, like a witch's power during the witch trials, it was derived from her sexuality. Like the idea was that she had made a compact with the devil, providing him with sex and receiving magical powers in return. That was like actually what was being, promoted by the church and the state and the Malleus Maleficarum, which was the witch hunter's Bible. And uh, and I think that those taboos are still we're still grappling with them, in modern medicine, which is it's kind of aghast. But if OBGYNs want to step up to the plate, we have so many resources and so much of a power to just say, hey, we need to change something about how we practice. And for some reason, they're just not willing to be confronted with the taboo. Um,
yeah, and it's the hardest thing for me was honestly my what happened to me, it was traumatic, but it became a lot more traumatic when I read the medical literature and I realized that the entire medical community was complicit in what happened to me.
mm,
And what I saw, what I observed was that basically the entire medical, or at least how it felt, was that the entire medical community did not think that what happened to me was worth preventing, that it was just an
mm,
acceptable thing to
yeah.
let happen. And that
Mm,
is what drives a lot of my advocacy because that sort of made me feel worthless, that I had something taken from me and that it was supposed to mean nothing and it was supposed to not matter. And when I passed out flyers at the ACOG annual meeting saying that there should be continuing medical education because it's not covered in residency, and I think for a lot of doctors it's covered even less than it was covered for you. And at the time in 2018, the only vulvar surgery listed in ACGME's like list of surgeries covered in OBGYN residency was radical vulvectomy. And then and there were no minimum procedure numbers for that. So what one urogynecologist I went to told me is that could mean just observing. So like the fact that you got to observe a labiaplasty, that sort of coverage I think is enough
Oh
to
yeah.
cross stuff off the list.
Oh
And
yeah.
then
Oh yeah.
and then you're considered eligible for privileges for that long list of things. That's
Well,
how
let's
I
talk. Yeah, let's talk about that super. I'll try to keep it brief because yeah, there is a big issue here within the hospital privileging system. Is hey, I've done this many procedures, and they say, great, go do it. That means you can start practicing tomorrow. If you were lying, if it's just not, you have your program director sign off or whatever. If you just saw 5 of them, that may be all that they require in order to give you privileges to do that. But even in residency training, there is a bare minimum list of things that you're supposed to have done and seen before you can even graduate from residency. And some of the procedures, like an open hysterectomy, is still, you still have to do like 25 of them. But how many women are getting open, big, giant incisions for a hysterectomy nowadays? So instead, we just look and we pop in and we scrub in and maybe touch a couple things. And then we say, oh, I was a part of that procedure. That's actually what we do because we
Mhm.
need to meet the bare minimum. Now, what the problem with that is that if a person does need an emergency open hysterectomy, we may have seen them, but we may need to call in some support from an older attending to help us even after we have privileges to do it on our own. The labiaplasty thing is not something that any resident, I'm sure, is getting, not just observing. They might see it from afar. Are they even touching the tissue? Are they even like drawing the line? Are they experiencing what it might be like to scalpel tissue under tension? And it's just simply not something we're trained to do. So we can't be offering something that we don't know how to do. That's
Mhm.
like a violation of bioethics. I mean, it's not even fraud. It's like immoral. It's unethical. Like this is not something you should be doing to somebody just because it looks
Yeah.
easy on TV
One
or whatever.
thing one thing I wanted to do was try and get privileges changed. The surgery center I went to is managed by this company, USPI. They're the biggest ambulatory care provider in the US, and my dad knew someone on the board, so I got in touch with them, and I tried to convince them to change their privileging nationwide to require training in labiaplasty before surgeons can get privileges to do labiaplasty.
Yeah.
And it didn't work. So I went back and forth with them, and they actually considered changing them nationwide, even though that's not normally how they do it. Because normally
Mhm.
the way that it works is each surgery center decides on how they do their privileges separately. And I convinced them it shouldn't be that way because, it's an elective surgery, so it should just be the same at every surgery center around the
Yeah.
country that they
Right.
manage. And so
Right.
then they agreed with that. And that was a big step that I convinced them of. But then what happened was they reached out to ACGME, the Accreditation Council of Graduate Medical Education, and they reached out to the American Board of OBGYN, and they told them that that board certified OBGYN should be able to do labiaplasties. So my understanding is they're giving privileges to do these surgeries just based on residency training and board
Yeah.
certification.
Man, I could talk to you for hours. This is super interesting. I think people are going to really dig this conversation because it gets into a lot of the weeds of what I think is actually a problem that is crippling advancement in the way that we provide care to women. So I really appreciate you being so um, candid in this conversation. I really believe in your advocacy. I don't do these procedures because I don't feel like I have adequate training, even if I
Yeah.
was still working in the hospital system. But that is me. I can't say that anybody out there wouldn't want to try to be a hero and do a procedure that they read about on, the atlas of, the Bagash's atlas or whatever.
Yeah, and it's not just being a hero. They make a lot of money on these.
Yeah,
That's the biggest motivation.
right, right,
Um, but just one thing that I meant to say is
sure.
back to the flyers, the ACOG annual meeting. When I was going around suggesting that there should be some kind of continuing medical education, that there should be formal training available to OBGYNs, the answers that I got was, um, women just shouldn't be getting those surgeries, right? So victim blaming. And I
Yeah,
said, "But these are approved by ACOG. where medically necessary, right? And I think actually in the latest committee opinion, they don't disapprove of cosmetic surgery anymore, right? So these surgeries are approved of. They are approved of by ACOG for medical reasons, even in women under 18. And yet the answer to, hey, maybe doctors should be trained is women just shouldn't be getting those surgeries, right? There is so much victim blame. One of the OBGYNs who told me that my surgery could not have affected my sexual function later told me when I said, "Hey, this did affect my sexual function. Here's how, please like be better informed,"
Yeah.
right? She
Yeah.
told me I should have known. So on one hand, she told me it couldn't have happened, and then later I was somehow supposed to know that what she thought couldn't have happened could have happened. Like, what? So
You're damned
there's
if you do, damned if you don't. Yeah.
yeah, and also yeah, so there was the one woman who said women just shouldn't be getting those surgeries. Actually, a couple, and it was women. It was mostly women I was talking to. So when I was on the Daily Show, they made it look like I was talking to men. But back then, I was actually kind of uncomfortable talking to men, right? Because on my flyer, it said that my vulva had been fucked up. Like I was
Yeah.
more comfortable. I was mainly approaching young women because that's who I thought I would have the best chance with. And they said women just shouldn't be getting those surgeries. And so one way I confronted that is I said, well, what about women who need these? And then the answer to that was, and I said, ACOG does approve them for medical reasons. And the answer to that was that they have more important things to worry about. So there's this attitude that sexual function is just not that important. And
Yeah.
this has actually come up a lot, like on Reddit. It's disturbing how alleged doctors on I don't know if they're real doctors, but there are people calling themselves doctors on Reddit. The way that they responded to me was like horrifying.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
uh, there's a thing in medicine where people they really don't like someone without medical training telling them they don't know something. And so they use
Mhm.
like authority to try and say, well, we're the doctors. You don't know what you're talking about. And and once it's established that I do know what I'm talking about, then the answer is, well, that's not important. And it's like nobody died because their clitoris didn't work. And it's like, what? Actually, it's very common for women to attempt suicide. Like just the other day, I got
Mhm.
contacted by a woman who at least was literally in the ER because she tried to kill herself. Or probably not in the ER anymore, but she was like contacting me from the hospital, right?
Wow.
And I mean, I was suicidal at one point. So it's just this is actually extremely, extremely important for female quality of life, and it's not getting treated like that.
Yeah.
And it's also like there is an unrecognized burden, I think, on the healthcare system when this stuff gets fucked up because those ER visits are expensive. I mean, one
Yeah.
lady, she didn't attempt suicide, but she checked herself into a mental hospital, and she also followed up with like 7 different doctors at the Cleveland Clinic, after she was harmed in a biopsy. And it's like, w why not just prevent that? Because that's expensive. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
and it's so easy to prevent. It's just like, people just need to know like basic anatomy to prevent these things. Um, but yeah, there's just this sort of attitude. It was really hard for me to take, like passing out these flyers and just kind of getting rebuffed over and over. Like it, yeah. I mean, in my opinion, before you do a surgery, you should be trained in that surgery. You should know the anatomy.
Yeah, it sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that's
Have
all I was trying to ask for. And
Yeah.
yeah, there was on my flyer, I had my story. And one OBGYN said, "Nobody cares about your story." Or she said, "Nobody's gonna care what happened to you." She said, "You should take that out."
What
I'm
the
like,
fuck? Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't we care about somebody's story? You're here to care for a person as another person. And by the way, 70
yeah, that was really weird. I don't know. It
it's a
was
weird fucking
weird.
thing to say to somebody.
Then was so what happened was I sort of like decided to crash the ACOG annual meeting at the last minute. And I think I drove up on Friday night and I went to like FedEx or somewhere and I had all these flyers printed out. And then I I don't know what I was doing. I was, like, on Tinder. I, like, matched with this cute, like, documentary filmmaker. It was funny because he commented on one of my posts, like, he was like, "I remember that." It was funny. But, so I, like, I had him come with me because I was like, "I need moral support. Do you wanna come?"
Yeah.
Like, so my idea was to catch OBGYNs at bars and be like, "Hey, you wanna talk about the clitoris?" Like, I thought that would be a good idea.
Did you have, like, your model,
Like,
your
and they're
model
like
with you and
I
everything?
didn't have a model at that point, I just had the flyers, but I thought, like well, because I got there pretty late at night, and I was like, "Well, no point in just going to the hotel and, like, doing nothing, might as well, like, go find the OBGYNs, like, maybe they'll be loosening up a bit," you know what I mean? Like
OBGYNs don't have fun. That was your first mistake.
yeah, so I went up to a couple of women, they were about my age, at a bar, and I said, "Hey, are you here for the, ACOG annual meeting?" They're like, "Yeah," and I was like, "Oh, so I have these flyers that I was gonna pass out, tomorrow, and I just wanna ask your opinion on them." So that was the context.
Yeah, yeah, right. Well,
Her
that's a
opinion was that
pretty charming way to engage them. Yeah.
her so one of them was pretty silent. The other one, her opinion was that my story didn't matter, and then she just left my flyers on the table. She didn't even take them. So it was, like, really demoralizing, and I was
Your
like, "Why do they
story
hate
doesn't
me?"
matter. Ugh.
And then she said, "And don't dress like that." And I'm like, "I'm obviously not gonna dress." I didn't say anything, but I was like, "Thanks for that advice." But it's like I was literally at a bar and I was wearing like silk shorts and a not revealing like tank top, like not even low, and just sleeveless basically, and a blazer. It it's
You
just
would have
like
fit right in at a conference. Yeah, it's at least it
dude,
sounds like it.
I mean it was like well, my shorts were, like, a little short for a conference, but yeah, the top of my outfit could have been totally appropriate,
Yeah.
and also, this was at a bar at night, and she was like,
Yeah,
"Make sure
this
you
is
don't
not
dress like that," and it's like, why do you so I think what it is, there is this thing where some doctors, they have this ego, and I think it comes from how doctors sacrifice so much, they work so hard, right, to get trained to be doctors,
yeah,
and then they have to justify that it's worth it, and they want commensurate respect and status,
yep.
with the effort that they put in. And so then if someone without who hasn't gone through that gauntlet comes up to them and says, "Hey, here's something that you don't know," or "Here's something about your field that should change," it triggers something in them
Yeah.
that but it's like, yeah, it causes them to react very badly, and I think this is something that is problematic about medical culture, and the reason why I think it's problematic is because I think it's a threat to patient safety.
Yeah.
This behavior where there's so much ego and unwillingness to recognize where there might be a problem, where maybe it would be a good idea to listen to someone, even if they're not a doctor. And the funny thing is I've talked to, like I've talked to engineers who work in like, healthcare technology and PhDs uh who work in like I forget, like stuff to do with pharmaceuticals. Like there was I forget details, but I just know there was this one guy who was doing research on drugs to help with Alzheimer's, and he has a PhD and something related to that. And he said,
Yeah.
"Yeah, doctors are notorious for not listening to people who are not doctors."
Yeah. Doctors are very confronted by even a nurse saying, "Doctor, I think your patient's short of breath or whatever." "Oh, they're fine. Give them some oxygen or whatever." Like, and meanwhile, they've got a big PEA and they die later. PE because they just didn't stop and listen to the nurse who's actually with them at bedside. So, for sure, doctors don't like being told what to do. They don't like having to admit that they were wrong. They don't like saying, "Hey, we should have probably been doing things better." And that is why I'm here with this podcast, doing all the advocacy work I'm doing in order to not burn the system down, but to create a life raft for people who are really not finding what they need in the medical system for a variety of reasons, which we won't get into right now.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
one thing crazy is how there was no recognition. I mean, ACOG still does not recognize the risk of what happened to me
yeah,
in their committee opinion. Even though, so I asked them to redo their committee opinion. I said, take out vaginal rejuvenation first of all. Take out because they were using that as a catch-all term for
yeah,
you know um, just all procedures, including labiaplasty. And I told them, take out the part about hypertrophy being caused by excess androgens. There's no evidence. and I said, add information about risks, and I said, add information about normal labia minora size. And they did not respond to me. They didn't acknowledge me, which is like very typical. But then they redid their committee opinion. So
Yeah.
I know that I had that impact.
Something there. Yeah. Yeah.
And and then when they redid it, they, you know, what did they do? The most disturbing thing is they have this table, and under clitoral hood reduction, it said the goal of clitoral hood reduction is to improve sexual function. And this is just a crazy, like, bullshit idea that
Mm.
someone came up with at one point to market these, to, I guess, to promote clitoral hood reductions. But it's like, this is like saying that circumcision improves male sexual function. I don't think anyone's gonna say that.
Yeah.
Um, right, because it's supposed, I mean, the idea is it makes the clitoral glands more exposed, but it's supposed to be protected by the clitoral hood. You can retract it. It anyway,
Yeah.
then under risk, and also there's just no evidence that clitoral hood reduction ever improves sexual function. So it's like, why is that in the ACOG committee opinion?
Yeah.
And then in the risk, it says damage to the glands, but it doesn't say, like, it doesn't recognize the risk of nerve damage, right? So
Mm.
to that's not gonna help doctors think about, like, "Oh, I need to avoid those nerves," and it's not
Yeah.
gonna help. I just yeah, so that's not correct. The other disturbing thing is in their list of procedures in the table, they have hymenoplasty, and it says goal of or I guess it's like intended goal is what it says, or like something like that, like what people say it does. So they're not necessarily agreeing, but they're still putting it there. So it says to restore a virginal appearance.
Oh my Lord.
This is yeah, ACOG committee opinion updated, I believe, in 2019.
Yeah, I found it here. It's yeah. Yeah, it's number 795. Well, I'm gonna link everything in the show notes.
And
Uh,
then under risk, actually, I don't remember what it says about risk of hymenoplasty, but like they just hymenoplasty shouldn't be getting done in the US. There's no defense. I
yeah.
think in the United Kingdom, they're trying to make it illegal, you know, like maybe we should follow in their footsteps.
Yeah.
Um, But yeah, what's really fucked up is the Aesthetic Surgery Journal gave an Editor's Choice Award to an article about a new hymenoplasty technique that basically guarantees the
Oh my
chance of
gosh.
bleeding. And the way they guarantee bleeding is they operate on the vagina and the vestibule also. So they don't just sew the hymen back together. They do some funky cut into the vagina and like
Yeah.
it's disturbing.
Man. How can people find your work? You're all over the social medias. Tell everybody what they need to know.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Mediclit, Mediclit, and I'm on TikTok at Jessica underscore Ann underscore pin PIN, and that's also my handle on Instagram.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm glad you were able to tell your story again. I know it's probably you feel like you're repeating yourself, but this is a very unique audience that I have, and I really think it's going to resonate. So thank you so much. And
All right,
if you
thank
wite a
you.
book, can you send me a book, or actually,
Well,
can you send me?
hopefully I wasn't too critical. My dad told me not to be too
No,
critical.
no, no. If you haven't listened to my podcast, I hope you will, and you will hear. Listen to the episode I just did on a briefish history of Western medicine, witches, and women healers, and you will see exactly who you're talking to. It probably
Okay.
would have been helpful for you to know that beforehand, because
Yeah.
I am not your typical OBGYN. I promise you that.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Enjoy Cape Cod.
Okay. Bye.